I'm Joe Twyman, as Mina said, the co-founder of the public opinion consultancy Deltapoll. What is a public opinion consultancy? We are in the business of helping people understand. And that's what my talk today is about. Understanding and connecting with your audience in an era of big data. So there's a lot going on there, and I want to take each bit in turn. But before I do, I want to draw your attention to the grey QR codes on the table in front of you. Because at the end of this, I say at the end, for sort of the second half of this, we're going to be doing some live polling. I'm going to be putting questions up on the screen and asking for your responses as the audience here today. And we'll see the results, and we will see how those results compare to countries across the world. In order to log into this, it's the grey QR code, but instructions will come up when we get to that. But before all of that, I want to take you through the story of today. We're going to start with understanding your audience. That's the first bit of today's talk. Then connecting with your audience. And this is a crucial part, because I really believe very strongly that you cannot really connect with your audience if you don't understand that audience. I'll talk about that in more detail, but that is the fundamental basis of this talk today. And then I'm going to talk about the impact of big data, what impact that has had on how we understand and connect with our audiences. And then we're going to go to interactive results, hopefully, and we're going to talk about big picture questions. But I want to start by talking about understanding your audience and what that means. As I say, you cannot connect with your audience if you don't understand them. And we at Deltapoll are in the business of doing that. And at this stage, I was inspired, motivated, however you want to characterize it, by a famous quote from the industrialist Henry Ford, who said, "If I'd asked my customers what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse." Henry Ford, of course, the pioneer of the motor car and mass automotive engineering in America. And this, for me, is often used as an example of why people don't understand their audiences. But actually, I think it illustrates very clearly how important knowing your audiences is. It was then, it is now. Because if you had asked your customers simply what they wanted in that era, they may well have said a faster horse, in which case you're not truly understanding your audience. Henry Ford truly did understand the audience. He would suggest, didn't need to ask them, but I would suggest, in contrast, that actually asking the audience, as we will later, is hugely important in connecting. But when putting this presentation together, I discovered something rather disappointing, and that's that Henry Ford never said this. This is not real. It's a widely quoted statement, but actually he never said it. Instead, what he said was, if there is any one secret of success, it lies in the ability to get the other person's point of view and see things from that person's angle as well as your own. And I think that simply re-emphasizes what I'm saying. So well done, Henry Ford, for both mythically and actually saying the point that I was trying to make. So that's where we start, the idea that you want to understand your audience. But it raises the question, of course, who are your audience? That's a key question whenever seeking to understand this. And indeed, many of the clients that I work with, be they investment companies or political parties or anything in between, are not just interested in their audience, I'm not asking them who are your audience. I'm also asking who are their audience. So, their opponents, their competitors, their potential acquisitions. It's about audiences both of your own and of others to really understand that. And who are your audience? Well, it probably goes without saying, but like every good presentation, I'm going to say it anyway. It could be your readers, if you're the national newspaper, or indeed many other media organizations. Or, increasingly, it could be viewers and listeners in a multimedia age, characterized by podcasts and YouTube streams. It could, of course, be your existing customers or your potential customers. All of these are audiences that are crucial to understand if you are to connect with them. Then, of course, if you're a campaign organization, or if you're wanting to change minds, you might want to speak to your supporters and connect with them. And on occasions, you may wish to connect with your opponents. And those supporters and those opponents may have very, very different views about a whole host of things. And then, of course, in my world of political research back in London, it's often about voters. What do voters think on particular issues? This is, of course, particularly important when you come from a country that decides to change its prime minister every 6 months. And an entire population. Your audience could be the entire population of a country. And when we come on to the interactive polling later, one of the things that we will be looking at are results from entire adult populations. So, how do we understand this? How do we connect with these groups? Well, it's really important to do so because of what I call the wicked hierarchy of outcome. If you're to connect properly, you need to really understand. That starts with data. Data, in my world, means public opinion surveys and various other types of data. But that is not all the data that is out there, as we'll come to when we discuss big data. But data, whether it's sales figures, audience figures, readership figures, or public opinion surveys, are all hugely important because it's from data that you derive information. Information leads to knowledge, and it's that knowledge that leads to understanding and wisdom. But this is a strict hierarchy. And if you don't get the data right, then it doesn't matter how much wisdom and understanding you can bring from outside. If you don't get that data right, you run the risk of fundamental errors when it comes to understanding your audience. And I think the best example of that I have found comes from a British scientist looking at a very difficult subject, specifically sex work and sex trafficking. This is a research scientist called Brooke Magnati from the UK. And she wrote a book on sex work. And as part of it, she analyzed 2 separate peer-reviewed academic articles. 2 separate academic articles. Prostitution and Trafficking in 9 Countries, an update on violence and post-traumatic stress, and Beyond Gender, an examination of exploitation in sex work. Now, the crucial thing about both of these articles is that they were academically rigorous. They were peer-reviewed. They were published in recommended, esteemed academic journals. So you would hope that the findings and wisdom gained from that were helpful, were useful to the book that Brooke Magnati was writing. And part of the work that was done asked about the percentage of sex workers wishing to stop working in the industry within 3 years. Farley et al. Found that figure was 89% through the surveys and the public opinion that was conducted by them. Jenkins found the figure was 3%. So is the answer 3% or is the answer 89%? If you are a legislator, if you are trying to work in this area, which one do you choose? Which one is the truth? Is the truth that almost all or almost none wish to exit the industry within 3 years? The answer is, ultimately, having looked at both articles, they were both wrong. They were both wrong. So if you used either, the data would be bad and it would undermine the rest of that wicked hierarchy. You would gain no understanding and no wisdom from that poor quality data. There was failure to address key aspects of understanding your audience. And I've put a picture here. This is how all research agencies in Britain advertise their services, with a woman of indeterminate ethnicity with a headset. I cannot stress enough how that is completely removed from the reality of political polling and opinion research in Britain. I have never met anyone who looks like that working in political research. Firstly, she's female, which is a big departure for many of us. But anyway, I digress. The secret to success in understanding is pretty simple. You just have to ask the right questions to the right people at the right time in the right way. That's how you understand your audience. But inevitably, of course, it is more complicated than that. It's a lot more complicated. The right questions can mean many, many different things. It can take many, many different forms. You can ask questions that are fair and balanced and tease out the nuance in opinions, or you can ask broad questions that are difficult to answer, that don't allow people to express their true beliefs. When it comes to the right people, the key to this is representative data. Data that is representative of the audience as a whole. And so simply speaking to some people can be enough in certain circumstances. I'll come on to talk about that. But if you speak to the wrong people, if you speak to people who are not representative of the wider audience, it will fundamentally undermine the data that you're collecting and affect your understanding. The timing can also make a huge difference. Any kind of opinion research, whether it's the kind that we're doing here among you today or the kind that is conducted every day across the world, is simply a snapshot of public opinion at that given time. And people's views can and do change. They evolve. Sometimes they change very quickly, sometimes very gradually, but they do change. And simply sticking with a single finding, a single moment of time, is often not enough. In 1966, Gallup, the American research agency, asked about attitudes to Martin Luther King. It found that 32% of people in America in 1966 had a positive view of Martin Luther King. By 1999, Americans, via a Gallup survey, selected Martin Luther King as the second greatest person of the 20th century, behind Mother Teresa. Opinions, and therefore understanding, changes over time. And also, surveys can be conducted in the right way and the wrong way. A lot of surveys in more economically active countries are conducted online nowadays, but that doesn't work in other countries. For 3 years, I worked in Baghdad, conducting surveys among the Iraqi population. That was done mainly via face-to-face research, because that was the right way to do things. Failure to ask in the right way, again, undermines your questions. So, I want to give you an example of how this works in practice. And in order to do that, I want to go back to the beginning of understanding audiences, the beginning of what geeks like me call quantitative research. Now, some of you may be saying, didn't quantitative research technically begin in Babylon, in the 4th century, 4,000 years ago. And yes, it did. So yes, I know we're basically at the home of quantitative research, but you'll have to forgive me. I'm going to concentrate instead on modern quantitative research, which began with the Harrisburg Pennsylvanian in 1824. Now, the examples that I'm giving from the history of research, from the history of understanding audiences, certainly at the beginning tend to be political in nature. The reason for that is that it's very rare that you get the opportunity to test your methods and your process against an actual outcome. But of course, elections, be they presidential elections or general elections in other countries, provide that opportunity. You can say, this is what voters, the electorate says, and you're held to account. And the Harrisburg Pennsylvanian is a good example of that. Harrisburg Pennsylvania was a newspaper in America, and it conducted the first reported opinion poll in 1824. And it found that Andrew Jackson was on course to win the US presidential election ahead of John Adams. Now, the good news for the Harrisburg Pennsylvanian is that Andrew Jackson did become US president. The bad news for the Harrisburg Pennsylvanian is that it wasn't in 1824. The very first example of trying to understand an audience that was ever published was wrong, and was wrong by some distance. Why was that? Well, it was based on 504 people in one town in Pennsylvania, trying to explain an entire audience across 13 different colonies at the time. So perhaps, to our eyes nowadays, not a surprise that understanding went wrong. The Literary Digest, an American periodical, improved somewhat on that success. It had a marketing campaign where it asked people to write on a card who they were going to vote for at the presidential election, and then send that card in to the Literary Digest, also saying whether they wanted to subscribe to the magazine or not. It was an interesting marketing campaign that worked very well. And it turns out it predicted the presidential election correctly in 1916, 1920, 1924, 1928, and 1932. So by 1936, when millions of people were now sending back their cards to the Literary Digest, it was felt that this was the way to understand audiences. What happened? On the front cover of the Literary Digest in 1936, they teased that inside the result would be announced. And so it was. Alf Landon was announced as the winner of the 1936 presidential election. And for anyone who knows anything about American politics, they may be wondering who President Landon is. He, it turns out, was not the winner. The winner is far better known, a guy called Franklin D. Roosevelt. Not only was Roosevelt's victory confirmed, it was also overwhelming. Alf Landon received 38% of the vote, 62% for FDR, a margin of victory among the largest of all US presidential elections. And once again, attempts to understand the audience went wrong. If you want to understand the audience, you needed to follow the ideas, which we still use today, of the new kid on the block, George Gallup. George Gallup's principle was, rather than focusing on millions of responses, to instead get a representative sample, to represent the audience you're trying to understand in a better way. And so that meant the right number of, for instance, old people, young people, men, women, people who live in the South, people who live in the North, etc., etc., if you want to represent that entire audience. Similarly, if you're with a company and you want to represent your employees, or if you're run a company that uses a particular customer base, then that customer base needs to be represented in terms of its demographics and much more. And George Gallup correctly predicted the 1936 US presidential election using this method, and went on to predict many other things, including the 1945 general election, which was far closer and far more of a surprise than America's 1936 presidential election. So the principle of understanding audiences is based on these principles. The question some people have is, well, how can just a small sample of people be representative of the wider population? How can just some people represent an entire audience? And the answer to that was provided very helpfully from Gallup. He used the example of soup. If you have a pot of soup, a big vat of soup to feed everyone here, you don't need to taste all the soup to know what flavor it is. Instead, providing it's mixed properly, you just need a couple of teaspoonfuls. Similarly, if you go to the doctor and they take a blood test, I would advise them not to take all of your blood. It's a similar principle. Of course, it's up to you. If you wish for the doctors to take all of your blood, that is entirely your decision. So, as time went on, Gallup's principles were used again and again, but they didn't always go, shall we say, brilliantly. And as time has moved on more recently, the question of how you connect with your audience is certainly something that has been raised many times. As we enter the later years of the 2020s, there are, of course, many, many ways to connect with audiences. Many more ways than there were even 5 years ago, let alone 10, 20, 50 years ago. In the era, particularly of social media, that interaction, that connection, tends to be two-way as well, and there are implications to that. But we're interested, when looking at understanding, in understanding how you connect with the audience, because there are different ways in which you connect, and measuring that is hugely important to understanding. You can measure awareness. If you're a campaign organization that is simply looking to build profile, or if you're Steve Jobs launching the Apple Mac in 1984, the first thing you want, and maybe the only thing you care about, is awareness. And you can measure this through various different ways, and public opinion surveys form an important part of that. But it's not everything. Because you can have awareness, but is that the same as agreement? If you're a campaign organization and you're looking to really engage with people, you don't just need someone to be aware of your campaign or your product or your output. You need them to agree with it as well. Now, I'm not here to say how you gain that agreement, but I am here to measure that agreement. That's where we come in, to measure the degree to which people agree with things. But even that increasingly is found to be not enough, and I'll come on to why. But the important bit is emotions. Some of you may have noticed that over the last 5 to 10 years, in many cases, in many countries, things have become, how shall I characterize it, more emotional. And as those emotions rise, emotional resonance becomes hugely important. You might agree with something, you might be aware of something, but if it doesn't connect with your heart, then is it really working? Well, the question remains to be seen. And even if it emotionally connects, can you bring about behavioral change? And to demonstrate why this is so important, I want to turn to a British example, arguably the most important political example of the last, however you want to count it, 50 or perhaps coming on to 100 years, the Brexit referendum. During the Brexit referendum, there were two main arguments by either side. The campaign to stay within the European Union emphasized the idea that the economic consequences of Brexit would be enormous. Project Fear, it was described. Leaving the European Union would have economic consequences. This was seen as a big argument. On the other side, those who wished to leave the European Union campaigned on the idea of taking back control. The idea that decisions would be made by those people in Britain, that we wouldn't be affected by people in Brussels and the European Union. Now, at Deltapoll, we developed something called the emotional resonance score. The emotional resonance score uses complicated calibrated technology to measure the degree to which people not just agree with a statement, but emotionally connect with it. And never was that more important than when looking at communicating with these audiences, Leavers and Remainers. 55% of people agreed with the take back control argument, 46% of people agreed with Project Fear. So in both cases, actually, a plurality agreed and relatively high levels of agreement. But the crucial number here is on the right-hand side, the ERS score out of 100. 57 out of 100 for Project Fear, 26 out of 100 for Project Fear, 57 for Take Back Control. The vote leave argument resonated with people emotionally in a way that the Remain argument simply didn't. So understanding how you connect with audiences relies increasingly on that idea of emotional connection. It's not enough, as people in Britain know on a daily basis, it's not enough to simply have agreement. You have to have that connection. And one of the things we did after this was once the Brexit vote had gone through, we then tested the degree to which a series of messages about Brexit were resonating in the years following. And we found, just before Theresa May left office, that across all of the measures we ran, emotional connection had fallen off a cliff. You couldn't effectively connect with your audience discussing Brexit using any of these messages. The reasons for that were complex and were numerous, but essentially people had switched off. Emotionally, they were no longer engaging, and this was very clear in the data. So to understand how to connect with audiences, I emphasize, it's not just head, it's heart as well. And so, what about big data? The era of big data. How does this change things? Well, the first question that I get asked a lot is, well, what do you mean by big data? And what I mean varies, depending on who I'm talking to. But it's always based on the idea of opinion data. And I know that that is only a small part of big data. And big data now encompasses all sorts of things, much of which can be used in good ways and bad ways to understand and connect with audiences. But it's been described by the World Economic Forum as the fourth industrial revolution, that it could be hugely important. Why is that? It's because of the amount of data that's out there. Let me give you an example. There was I think it's pronounced exabytes, who knows? There was 5 exabytes of information created between the dawn of civilization through to 2003. That was from Eric Schmidt when he was CEO of Google back in 2010. He was giving a presentation, and he was talking about the fact that 5 exabytes, which is 5 million terabytes of information, was created between the dawn of civilization to 2003. By 2010, it was estimated the world would create more data than that every 2 days. So every 2 days, by 2010, we were creating more data than we had from the dawn of civilization to 2003. That's what we mean by big data. By 2025, it is estimated the world will create more data than that every 16 minutes. Every 16 minutes, in just 2 years' time, we will create more data than from the dawn of time to 2003, which I think we can all agree is a really long time. Every 16 minutes. Of course, some people think of these things purely in terms of computers. Our computers, our laptops, our phones, but it's so much more than that now. It's everything from your computer to your smart fridge. Does anyone have a smart fridge? No, never found anyone who has a smart. One person has a smart fridge. Finally found the one person who has a smart fridge, and for reasons that we'll come on to, I hope it wasn't one of these. Your fridge is recorded. If you have a smart fridge that's connected to Wi-Fi, it's recording the contents of the fridge. All that data is being stored as part of the Internet of Things. And the Internet of Things is what's been so important in delivering big data. And all of that can be used by Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, and Google, but it can also be used by organizations such as my own. This is, again, looking at Vote Leave, and it's taking more data than simply agree or disagree, support, oppose. And it's doing what's called a binomial logit analysis to understand the underlying motivations. Because if you want to connect with your audience, understanding those underlying motivations is really important, as Henry Ford knew, and as that false quote says. And so this looks at, once you control for other factors, what are the most important things deep down in determining whether someone was a supporter of Brexit or not. And you can also bring a lot of data together to do far more complicated analysis than anything that was possible. This is a map showing audience connection. Unfortunately, I can't tell you what the data says, but you'll have to trust me when I say it's very interesting. And it was produced using something called multi-level regression with post-stratification weighting, which, for those of you that don't speak cybergeek, essentially allows you to model connections among audiences across very diverse geographical areas, but also to model what individual areas within that look like. And so you can model connection for a product, a service, an organization, a campaign, an individual, and see the degree to which that person, that organization, etc., connects with their audiences on a vast scale. But there are bad signs. Signs that this is not all good news. And my favorite example of the downsides of big data comes from Adele. Adele, the British pop singer. What has Adele got to do with big data? Big data has heralded a huge amount of information and data in lots of different areas of our lives, but particularly in public opinion research. Unfortunately, a lot of that data is now of very poor quality. And anyone who's tried to use ChatGPT will know that some of the responses it comes up with are not necessarily particularly helpful. So Adele provides my favorite example of bad big data. And it comes from the Daily Mail, specifically the Mail Online, one of the widest read news sites in the English-speaking world, and it announced that, I can't believe I'm even saying this, 64% of women, 2/3 of women, 2 in every 3 women, have listened to Adele's song Hello, and as a result, have called an ex in order to reconcile. Two in every 3 women. Now, the article doesn't specify whether we're talking about all women in the world or all women in Britain or America or all women reading the Mail online. But regardless of the audience it's talking about, the suggestion that 2 in every 3 women have not just listened to Adele's song Hello, which is a bit of a stretch to begin with, but also have called an ex to reconcile. Where does this come from? This comes from a survey, specifically a study by the dating website whatsyourprice.com. I'll say that again. The dating website whatsyourprice.com, a site where you can go and register your interest in being paid to go out on dates and your interest in paying someone to go out on a date. And in case you're wondering, yes, that is very dodgy sounding to me too. So, there are bad signs to big data as well. Cambridge Analytica and what we saw with that, deeply problematic. Facebook has been asked, along with Twitter and many other social media platforms, has been asked to speak in front of the US Congress about their use and misuse of data. And I'm sure I don't need to remind anyone about the huge amounts of misinformation and disinformation that is now part of that huge amount of data created every 16 minutes. The Internet of Things provides that data, but it also has a flip side of bad news. Remember that smart fridge? This is a Samsung smart fridge. It uses a version of Linux in order to analyze the food in your fridge. Those fridges were hacked. An exploit was used by a hacker to launch the largest denial of service attack ever in the world at that time. It was so large, it was 4 times the size of any denial of service attack. For those of you that don't know, that's basically you bombard a website, in this case a tech journalist's website. You bombard it with requests until the website crashes. That denial of service attack was 4 times the size of anything that had previously existed, and it was all powered by hacked smart fridges across the globe. So, big data is not all good news, but it is a crucial aspect of the process. I now want to turn to the interactive results section. This is a series of polls, hopefully, that will show you where our audience sits compared to the world. So please join at slido.com. You can use this QR code or you can use the QR code in front of you. The way it's going to work, he says, hopefully, aspirationally, is that I'm going to ask a question and we're going to all vote and see what happens. So, if you're ready, we'll start. Overall, compared to 5 years ago, do you feel more safe, less safe, or about as safe as you did 5 years ago? These questions are all taken from reputable international surveys, from Pew, from Gallup, and from the World Values Survey. If you could all 60, the number in the top right-hand corner is going up nicely. And we're going to start off with general overall questions, and then we're going to look at some key questions of the day. I have no idea how long it takes for people to vote, but please vote early, vote often, as they used to say. When the number stops going up, okay, right. So let's look at the results among this audience. And I should say, I'm going to make all of this data, the data that I show, but also the data that's collected from the audience, we're going to, at an aggregate level, not at your individual level, we're going to make that available to the national for their use. The answer, 37% feel more safe, 32% about as safe, 28% less safe. How does that compare internationally? Plurality of people feeling more safe. Well, let's look at different countries. And you can see there's a big divide. Across all of these slides, I haven't been able to include all of the countries' results, but I have included the G7 where possible. I've included the UAE where possible, but then I've also included those at either end of the scale. 8% in France, feel more safe. 31% feel less safe. 56%, more than half of people in Brazil, feel less safe. 66% in China, and a majority of the UAE feels more safe. Next, which statement is close to your view? Either is neither is exactly right. Your country will be better off in the future if it sticks to its traditions and way of life. Your country will be better off in the future if it opens to changes regarding its traditions and way of life. So, please vote now. This key, I don't really know what to do on stage while people are voting. This is an important question about the nature of our countries and how we view the future. 62, 65. Can we get to? I feel like an auctioneer now. Can I see 70? 66. Okay, that's probably enough. What we see here among this group, and may I say, I'm not entirely surprised by this, we see an embrace of change and an openness, characteristic, I might say, of this region, more so than certain regions in my own country. How does that compare internationally? As you can see, a huge variation, but again, one that is perhaps not that surprising. South Korea and Singapore overwhelmingly have a view towards change. In contrast, Greece, Hungary, France, Israel, far less likely to support change. And the United Kingdom, 69% for change, despite so much emphasis in my own country on continuity and tradition over the last few years. Next, when you add up all the advantages and disadvantages of social media, would you say social media has been more of a good thing or more of a bad thing for democracy in your country? Good thing or bad thing? So we've gone from big questions to now questions about social media. Such an important aspect of modern life in so many different countries. Up to 51. What do we find? Good thing. 2/3 to 1/3. Oh, creeping up. Good. A good thing for your country. How does that compare? Well, again, big differences. Look at the United States. Only 1/3 of people in the United States believe that it is a good thing for democracy in their country. And that compares to 3/4 of people in Singapore and 2/3 of people in Poland. In the UK, we're split pretty much down the middle. Next, do you think access to the internet and social media has made people more or less informed about current events in your country? Or has it not made an impact either way? Overwhelmingly, more people believe that it has made people more informed. And this, interestingly, is very closely aligned with the general picture. For many countries, you can see at the top there, Sweden, Japan, Netherlands, and Greece, forming the top tranche of respondents, there is a feeling that it makes people that it provides more information, but even among the least popular countries, the countries where it's least popular, United States and Malaysia and Belgium, you still have a majority of people believing that it's provided more. And then next, do you think access to the internet and social media has made people more or less easy to manipulate with false information and rumors? Or has it not had an impact either way? So people have access to more information, but do they also have access to more disinformation? Is there a flip side to this good news? What do we find? Overwhelmingly more. More easy to manipulate with false information and rumors. And across the world, that is a widely held belief. And for me, this demonstrates the nuances of public opinion. If you want to understand, if you want to connect with your audiences, appreciating those nuances is hugely important. Because yes, people believe that you can get that it can be good for democracy, that it can provide more information, but also that it can provide disinformation. Next, how worried are you that your personal information may be stolen when using social media? Somewhat worried is the consensus here. Worldwide, it varies enormously. Brazil, Iraq, India, concern is much, much higher. The UK and the UAE, it's somewhat worried that wins out. UAE is not worried. Half of people here, along with Jordan, are not worried about that. So that demonstrates nuances around social media. What about AI? These days, there are machines or robots that can think and make decisions on their own, often known as artificial intelligence. Do you think artificial intelligence will mostly help or mostly harm people in this country in the next 20 years? Will AI be a help or a harm? Mostly a help. That's what we think here. What does the world think? I would describe this as unsure. The jury is still very much out on AI across the world. And whereas for an audience such as this, it may be seen as a positive, that is certainly not the case for wider audiences across different countries. From AI to climate change, do you think climate change is a very serious threat, a somewhat serious threat, or not a threat to the people in this country in the next 20 years? %69% here, very serious threat. But that is in contrast to many countries in the world, but at the same time aligned with others. You see a huge difference from China and Saudi Arabia and the UAE at the bottom, up to Brazil, United Kingdom, and Italy at the top. Could you tell me how much confidence you have in the press? You'll have to excuse the question wording. This is an example of what happens when you use international wording that works equally well or equally badly in all different countries. How much trust and confidence do we have in the press? I have a sense of what we might get among this audience. What do we find? Not bad. Not bad. Certainly better than the results worldwide. You can see that, that nowhere is there a huge amount of trust, except perhaps with Japan. But what about going further? Journalists and media involved in corruption. Is it a few of them, none of them, most of them, all of them? A few of them is the view in here, but what do we find? A few of them similarly, but some countries very much the outlier. Indonesia, Singapore, and Turkey, far more likely to say none. Japan, Peru and Greece particularly, most of them. Huge variation depending on which country you are from. Next, the effects of immigration. The effects of immigration on the development of your country. For each of the following effects of immigration, please tell me whether you agree or disagree with it. Leads to social conflict. So does immigration lead to social conflict? Agree or disagree? I'm running over time, so apologies for that, but I'm also going to fast forward through this. Disagreement here, in the majority. Overall, again, big differences. Jordan, Germany, two countries that have experienced enormous amounts of immigration over the last few years, agree. Indonesia, Philippines, Iran, China, disagree. And then with Britain and the United States, relatively similar results there in the middle. How about people from other countries coming here to work? Which of the following do you think the government should do? Let anyone who comes in let anyone come who wants to. Let people come as long as they're here, as long as there are jobs available. Place strict limits on the number of foreigners who can come here. Prohibit people coming here from other countries and don't know. Let people come here as long as there are jobs available, which is, in many cases, the favored response across the world. And again, a reflection of the nuances in public opinion. Whether you agree or disagree with immigration can often be explained in more detail by whether you are, shall we say, economically pragmatic about the situation. How satisfied are you with how the political system is functioning in the country these days? Not satisfied at all, to 10, or to 9? How is it functioning in your country? There's a 10 there, it just wasn't on the slide. A lot of satisfaction in this room, but perhaps the international comparison is more interesting. 8 to 10 there. Vietnam, Tajikistan, and South Korea at one end. Brazil, Zimbabwe, Puerto Rico, Iraq at the others. And then again, the G7 countries, you have the United States and Great Britain in the middle, and Canada and Germany at the other end. And then lastly, From what you know, how would you rank the following countries and groups of countries in terms of their importance in the world? So this is a ranking question. Not sure how this is going to work on the app. Let's find out. So you have to rank all of these. Now, good news. This is exclusive data. What I'm about to show you has not been seen by anyone. I don't know why the African Union suddenly got that. Yeah, I think this is more difficult to use, which is why I put it at the end. But this is exclusive data from Deltapoll. We conducted a survey looking at the relative importance of different countries and groups of countries among European countries and the United States in order to view among European countries how the world order looked. And so what did we find? Ten participants are ranking as we speak, 9, 7. So we have the United States, China, the European Union, the Arab League, Russia, Great Britain. Oh, Great Britain's dropped off. I don't think I envisaged this would take quite so long, so. All right, we're going to get to 50, and then I'm going to show the results. Although it's pretty obvious. Oh. Okay, so those are the results. US, China, European Union, Arab League, India, Russia. What do the countries of Europe and the US think? Well, they all put the United States at 1. Then there's some debate about whether it's the European Union or China, and then Britain comes further down, except in Britain, where we put ourselves at number 2, where we believe that Great Britain is the second most important country in the entire world, which I think tells you an awful lot about me and everyone like me. But perhaps of interest to this group, Australia ranks above the Arab League. Australia responsible for, and the Arab League, obviously responsible for quite a lot. And yet, there we are. And the African Union and Brazil at the bottom as well. This shows you where we are in terms of the new order as viewed by Europe and the United States. They still see the European Union and the United States as the most important countries and groups of countries in the world. They see China as important, but Britain up there as well, still based on the old ideas of the Security Council, and so on and so forth. So this is just an illustration of what this audience thinks. As I say, I will connect up. I want to leave you with this to finish. This is from Douglas Adams. He says, I've come up with a set of rules that describe our reactions to technologies, and I think this is the best way of explaining big data. Anything that is in the world when you're born is normal or ordinary, is just a natural part of the way the world works. Anything that's invented between when you're 15 and 35 is new and exciting and revolutionary, so you can probably get a career in it. Anything invented after you're 35 is against the natural order of things. I think if you want to understand your audience, if you want to connect with your audience, and if you're doing this in an era of big data, it's very important to remember that. Thank you very much. My name is Joe Twyman. These are my contact details. I'm also on whatsyourprice.com if you are particularly interested in that, but there we go. Thank you.